Okay, so hello everybody. In this video lecture, we will cover chapter 12, the central nervous system. And part of this chapter will be also explained in your lab PowerPoints. So make sure you read the whole chapter, make sure you read PowerPoint for this PowerPoint, and also all your lab PowerPoints to prepare for your tests. And I do have more videos posted on Canvas about this topic. So just when you go on Canvas, when you click on modules and you go to chapter 12 and then central nervous system lab or nervous system lab, make sure you read everything and you watch every single video that is posted on Canvas. So let's go ahead and begin. So central nervous system contains of the brain and spinal cord. And cephalization is development of the head. And it's, of course, increase the number of neurons in the head and allow you for higher level thinking and actions. And highest level is reached in a human brain. So when we're looking at the brain, right, so we have outer part of the brain that's called cerebral cortex, right? Cortex is made from a gray matter. And then under the cortex, inferior to cortex, we might have white matter, we might have gray matter, but that gray matter that is under the cortex will be called nuclei. So cortex is a gray matter, and gray matter mostly made of cell bodies of neurons and dendrites. And that gray matter is called cerebral cortex. Also, cerebral cortex has folds, right? And that, please read about it in your lab lecture. But when we're looking at cerebral cortex, we can divide it into three major functional areas: motor area, sensory area, and association area. Of course, a conscious behavior involves the entire cortex. So motor area control your voluntary movements. Sensory area allow you conscious awareness of sensation. And association area integrates this diverse information. Now you can see over here that we have voluntary movement and we have conscious awareness, right? So everything that reaches your cerebral cortex reaches your consciousness. So you might receive information from your visceral organs, for example, for your blood pressure, for your oxygen level. This information you don't understand. That means it does not reach your cerebral cortex. Everything that reaches your cerebral cortex, you understand, or you have some awareness of this sensation. And also all your voluntary movements, everything that you move your bones, right, using your skeletal muscles, or you move your skin using your skeletal muscles. If you do this voluntary movement, so it's also originated in your cortex. Okay, so over here, this diagram show you different color codes for different area, right? So we have motor area that's shown in a bright red, right? And motor association area or premotor cortex, so that would be premotor cortex. Now we have this blue stuff that is somatosensory area, so that's a sensation. And again, you have somatosensory association cortex. Now primary cortex, also over here, primary visual cortex on the occipital lobe, right? So we have primary motor, primary somatosensory, right, shown over here, primary auditory cortex, so everything in dark blue, and primary visual cortex, that's our sensory area. And then light blue is sensory association area. Light red is premotor cortex or motor association area. And of course, this kind of like pinkish area, this is called multimodal association cortex. So that means that this involved in a different type of sensation and movement, right? So very kind of more complicated part of your consciousness right here. And here parasagittal view, right? So also you can see this different part of the cortex that we just discussed. Now let's look at motor area in a little bit more details. So we have primary motor cortex or somatic motor cortex. We have premotor cortex. We have Broca's area and frontal eye field. And I kind of put this little arrows. Oh, I bless you. And please also, guys, can you silence your microphones? And when you need to talk to me, then, you know, please unmute them. So primary motor cortex. It's shown over here with red color. Now this area called precentral gyrus, right? Because, you know, this part of the brain that kind of go up, right? This is called gyri, and the one that goes down, those called sulci. So this is central sulcus between red and blue. This is central sulcus. And before the central sulcus, we have precentral gyrus. So that's the area of primary motor cortex. Now, what do you find over there? You would find there long axons. Well, you will have, of course, cell bodies, right, of neurons, and they will have long axons that go all the way down to the spinal cord, and axon will form corticospinal tracts or pyramidal tracts. Now, this part allows for conscious control of precise, skilled, voluntary movement, right? So, you need to initiate your movement, right? Precise movement, voluntary. That's the area that will fire, right? This electrical impulse. Now we have motor homunculi, and those are like a little person representing the motor innervation of body regions. So homunculus is this next picture, right? So here you can see our primary motor cortex, and every part of it responsible for movement of different part of your body, right? So you can see like this area, this is where, you know, this area responsible for toe movement, for knee movement, right? For finger movement, here for movement of your lips, right? Tongue, swallowing, right? So every part of it is responsible for its precise movement of different body parts. So that was this red part in a precentral gyrus. Now, anterior to the precentral gyrus, we have premotor cortex. And well, this is like association area, right? So this control your learned, repetitive, pattern motor skills, coordinate your simultaneous sequential action, and it's also involved in planning of movement that depends on sensory feedback, right? So you receive your sensory feedback and you plan your movement, right? So that's kind of cortex that help your primary motor cortex. Broca's area, shown here with the arrow, it's anterior to the inferior region of premotor area, and is present in only one hemisphere, usually the left. And this is motor speech area, the direct muscles of the tongue. So if you have a patient with a stroke in Broca's area, right, and stroke means part of the brain dies over here, right, then patient would have problem with talking, right, because they cannot move their tongue, and right, so, and sometimes even kind of like meaningful speaking. So they might talk, but it might have, you know, kind of like either they have hard time talking or it might not make much sense. So this area active when one prepares to speak. So that's a Broca's area found in only one hemisphere. And it's part of the motor association of cortex, right over here. So primary motor, And then we have, let me just remind you very quickly. I'll go back over here, right? And so we have primary, red one, premotor cortex, and here's the Broca's area. Now, one more that we need to discuss in this motor association area will be frontal eye field. So it's located right here, and it's anterior to the premotor cortex and superior to Broca's area. And this one controls voluntary eye movements, right? Remember, everything that comes from cortex in the motor area involves your voluntary movement. This one specifically for eye movement, Broca's area for tongue movement, right? And if you see this primary motor cortex on a homunculus, you can see how the different parts responsible for movement of your body parts, right? So that's a motor area. Now, sensory areas. We have lots of sensory areas. Primary somatosensory cortex, somatosensory association cortex, visual area, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, visceral. This one comes from your internal organs, and vestibular cortex. So again, look at them in more details. So primary somatosensory cortex. But first, let's look at this word, somatosensory. Somatosensory means really that information, sensory information that reaches your cortex and it reaches your consciousness. You really understand this sensation. And this sensation comes actually from your skin, skeletal muscle, and joints. Right, with your skin, what you can feel? You can feel touch, pressure, temperature, texture of something, right? Is it smooth, is it rough? From skeletal muscle, you feel movement of your skeletal muscle. For example, if you close your eyes and let's say somebody will move your arm, or somebody start moving your fingers. Even you are not moving them, you feel that movement, right? So that means this sensory information of movement and proprioception. Proprioception is where your parts of your body are in space. You can understand even without looking at your muscles, right? And also from joints. So if somebody, I don't want to give you example when you close your eyes and you moving your arm, right? Because you can say, of course I feel it because I just decided to move my arm, or I just decided to move my fingers. But even if you close your eyes and you are not moving anything, but somebody moving it for you, you still feel this movement and you know exactly where your arms are, where your legs are, where your toes are. That's called proprioception as well, right? So that's this what information come from your skeletal muscle and joints, and from skin I already told you, pressure, touch, temperature, texture of the object that you're touching, right? That's this all information actually received by primary somatosensory cortex, and it's located in where? Post-central gyrus. So we have this red pre-central gyrus for motor, primary motor cortex, and post-central gyrus for somatosensory cortex. So it's capable of spatial discrimination, so identification of body region being stimulated. So you know exactly if somebody touching your arm or leg or head, you're not confused. And we also have this homunculus for sensory cortex as well. So if you compare motor cortex and somatosensory cortex, so motor will be anterior to the sensory. Sensory cortex is posterior. You can see some similarities, but they're not identical, because sometimes you have lots of sensation in some area, for example, genitalias or abdominal some sensation, but you don't have lots of muscles, skeletal muscles to move those organs, right? So there are some similarities, but they're not identical. Okay, so now we're moving posteriorly to somatosensory association cortex. So it's posterior to primary somatosensory, to this blue one, and it's integrate sensory input from primary somatosensory cortex.
Yeah, you can.
Okay, guys, need to turn off, mute your microphones, please. So this part of the brain determines size, texture, relationship of part of the object being felt, right? So you touching something, then, you know, you're touching, you know, oh, I'm touching something. So this is your primary. But now, okay, well, what texture is that? Is that kind of big or small? That's your association. Kind of like you associate this information with what you already know, right? Now we have visual primary cortex shown in dark blue over here. And this is extreme posterior tip of the occipital lobe. Calcarine sulcus, there is a sulcus over here that goes kind of like deep. So that's a sulcus over here right in the middle. But this one receives visual information from retinas. And then we have visual association area. And this is interpret what you see, right? You can interpret it as a color, form, movement, right? So one thing to see something, right? And another thing to interpret this information. Because, for example, if you see, well, compare your vision with the vision of, for example, a dog or something, we can see the same object, right? So we use the same primary visual cortex located in a similar area, but how we interpret it will be very different, right? And this is how developed is association area is. So obviously we'll interpret it differently than, for example, your dog, right? And that's the cortex visual association areas that are responsible for that. And of course, complex processing involves entire posterior half of the hemisphere. Because not only you see the color, first you need to know what color is that. You need to learn this color, you need to store these memories about color or form, right? Remember when you're little, they teach you this is red, this is yellow, right? So that's all the job of the entire, you know, cortex over here, or form. This is square, this is circle, right? Oh, okay, so that's a visual association area. Now we're moving to auditory cortex. And again, all primary cortex shown in dark blue, right? So that's our primary auditory cortex. It's superior margin of the temporal lobes. So that's our temporal lobe, and that's a superior part. And this one interprets information from inner ear as pitch, loudness, and location. And then we have the second area shows to the light blue, auditory association area, posterior to the primary auditory cortex, and this stores memories of sounds, permits perception of sounds, right? Not only you hear something, but you know. So this one responsible just for hearing. But let's say if somebody has stroke in this auditory association area, they might hear a sound, but they would not realize that, oh, it's a dog barking, right? Because the association area might be damaged, right? So now we're moving to olfactory cortex, and this is mid-sagittal cross again, and it's a medial aspect of temporal lobe. So it's shown over here in this dark blue. Olfactory cortex means you can smell stuff, right? And it's part of primitive rhyencephalon together with olfactory bulb that's shown right here and olfactory tract. And this is your conscious awareness of odors, right? So this is the olfactory information or your smell. It's actually the only sensory information that moved from the receptors, right? Your nerve, olfactory nerves, to your cortex before it going through thalamus. Because all sensory information goes through the thalamus first, and thalamus is a, you know, it's a part of diencephalon of your brain. And again, you guys need to read your anatomy PowerPoint right before, and you know where the thalamus is. So all sensory information goes through the thalamus, and then from thalamus directs it to the appropriate part of the cortex. Smell goes to cortex first and then goes to thalamus. All right, so gustatory cortex are in insula. So insula is another lobe, right? Because we have frontal, we have parietal, we have occipital, we have temporal lobes, right? And one lobe kind of like inside, right? So if you look at the brain and you make like a coronal cross over here, coronal cut. So this shown here in brown color, that's insula. So in insula, you would find gustatory cortex, and that's your perception of taste. Also in the insula, you would find visceral sensory area. So information from your internal organs, from a viscera that reach your consciousness. Because lots of visceral sensation doesn't go to your cortex at all. So your brain constantly monitoring lots of parameters of your body, like your oxygen level, carbon dioxide level, glucose level, you know, heart rate, blood pressure. Your brain receives this sensory information from your visceral organ, but you have no idea. I have no idea what my blood pressure right now is it low or high, right? But some visceral information reaches your consciousness, then it goes to this visceral sensory area, and it's also an insula. And this is how you feel that your stomach is upset or your bladder is full, right? So it's also, it's posterior, so it would be kind of posterior in the insula area. And another cortex that located in the insula is vestibular cortex. And it's also part of the parietal cortex, right? So, so vestibular cortex kind of would be over here. And so it's partially in insula and partially in the parietal, because that's a frontal lobe, this is central sulcus, and this is parietal lobe. That's occipital, this is temporal. So you have kind of like three primary cortex associated with insula, right? Let's review it again. And it would be a gustatory cortex, a visceral sensory cortex, and vestibular cortex, right? Okay, and now we're moving to multimodal association area. So multimodal association area receive inputs from multiple sensory area and sends outputs to multiple area, including premotor cortex, because you do need to receive some sensory information before making your movements. So it's allow us to give meaning to information received, store it as a memory, compare it to previous experiences, decide on action to take. And multimodal association area shown here in this, I don't know, kind of like maybe pink color, and some here on the diagram below in the orange color. So it's include anterior association area, or another name is prefrontal cortex, posterior association area over here, and limbic association area that is deep in the brain. That's multimodal association area. So anterior association area of prefrontal cortex, most complicated cortical region, involves with intellect, cognition, recall, personality. It contains your working memory needed for judgment, reasoning, persistence, conscience. Development depends on feedback from social environment. So in your prefrontal cortex, this is where your personality is, right? This is when you working on your exam, that's the area that is active. This is when you make decision what to eat for breakfast, right? That's the area that is active. And this is where you can tell right from wrong, right? This is something that may help you to make informed decision in your life. That's where your personality is, right? So let's look again. That's your anterior association area or prefrontal cortex. Now, posterior association area is large region of temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes and play a role in recognizing patterns of faces and localizing us in space, involved in understanding written and spoken language, that is Wernicke's area. I'll show you over here. So before we get to limbic, oh, okay, no, I don't have it here. So I will show you this Wernicke's area. So you see this area over here, shown with dotted lines. This is Wernicke's area. This is Broca's area, and this is Wernicke's area. Broca's area and Wernicke's area, they only found in one hemisphere, usually left, right? So they're not symmetrical. So if somebody have a stroke in the Wernicke's area, this person would have problem to understand when somebody is talking to them or understand the written language, right? So this way in Broca's area, they would have problem talking themselves, right? They have hard time talking. In Wernicke's area, if that area is damaged, they have problem with understanding what somebody else tells them, right? So that's our posterior association area. And of course, limbic. So I'm gonna leave it over here. So that's a limbic. Limbic is emotional area of your brain, right? This is where your fear, this is where your memory is, right? So, so that's, and your emotions, all this stuff. So that's in the limbic area. Also, we kind of tends to put different functions in different hemispheres, and it's called lateralization. It's division of labor between hemisphere, but of course it's flexible because there is constant connection between hemispheres, but usually left hemisphere are responsible for analysis, logic, numbers, science, accounting, linear thoughts, and the right hemisphere for creative solution, innovation, intuition, risk-taking, imaging, holistic thoughts. All right, so that's kind of this division of the labor, but again, it's flexible. We do have cerebral dominance, and cerebral dominance is determined in which hemisphere you have Broca's and Wernicke's area. So if you think I'm left-handed, then my right hand, because it's contralateral. So if you're right-handed, then you would think, oh, my left hemisphere is dominant. If I'm left-handed, my right hemisphere is dominant, but it's not how it's determined. They actually need to find out where do you have your Broca's area and Wernicke's area. So remember over here, so that's Broca's, that's Wernicke's area. And in 90% of people, it's in the left hemisphere. So we have left hemisphere as dominant hemisphere. But 10% of people, they have it in the right hemisphere, right? So, so left hemisphere controls language, math, and logic, and right insight, visual, spatial skills, intuition, artistic skills, and they do communicate, of course. And the communication, you know, of course, depends. Some people might have a little bit better communication, some might not have that great, but we all have communication between hemispheres, so it's all flexible. Now, we talk about cerebral cortex, right? So, that's a good picture over here. So I told you that cortex is this gray matter. You see how it covers the surface of the brain? And what you see here in purple color and red color, this is also gray matter. They just use different colors. But when you see this gray matter, that means you have a lot of cell bodies and dendrites. And when you see white matter, this is where axons of neurons are, right? So we talk about cerebral cortex and all these different area, right? Somatosensory, motor, premotor, association, multimodal association area. That was all part of the cortex. Now we're gonna look at white matter. So white matter are these myelinated fibers that form tracts. Now the fibers, they can go in different directions. So you can see over here some fibers, so those are axons. Some fibers connect right and left hemispheres, right? So information moves from right to left, from left to right. Then this is called commissure, right? So over here, this green, I don't know if it had, yeah, right there, commissure. And the biggest commissure is corpus callosum, the one that connects right and left hemisphere. Now also, sometimes information need to move up and down, right? And then those fibers are called projection fibers. So here's projection fibers, so information moving up and down. And another axons of fibers, information moves front, back, so it pretty much connects different parts of the same hemisphere, shown here in red, and then it's called association fibers. So we do have cortex, right? We have gray matter inside. I forgot to tell you, this is called nuclei, right? One nucleus, several nuclei. And white fibers or axons, we can call either commissure or projection fibers or association fibers, depends what direction they carry information, both sensory and motor, right? Okay, so, and now we're gonna look at well, what is called basal nuclei, right? The old name was basal ganglia. That is, you know, anatomically not correct. Now they call it basal nuclei. Where would be a good thing to show you? Okay. So remember, I told you everything that is inside surrounding by white matter, but that's a gray matter. That's called nucleus, right? So here's putamen, that's a nucleus. Globus pallidus, that's a nucleus. Caudate, right, this part, that's also nucleus. Together they make structure that's called basal nuclei or basal ganglia, right? So that's a basal ganglia, gray matter, kind of not on the surface, but inside your brain. And it says over here, we have basal ganglia, it's subcortical, means below the cortex. Nuclei means gray matter. And it consists of corpus striatum, that is made of caudate nucleus and lentiform nucleus, and lentiform nucleus made of putamen and globus pallidus. Right, so pretty much this is the whole structure, 1, 2, 3, right? This is basal ganglia, very important structure in many neurological diseases, like Parkinson disease, for example, right? So that's why you know, we talking about this basal nuclei. It's also associated with structures is called substantia nigra. Substantia nigra. And I'll show you. So here again, you can see this caudate nucleus, this structure over here, lentiform, putamen, globus pallidus that make a lentiform, right? And that's all called corpus striatum, and corpus striatum is that basal ganglia. Where's the okay, so here's also a different section, right? So 1, 2, 3. So this 3 structure, right? This is our basal ganglia, right? This 3 structure. Now, basal ganglia also associated with the, so now we're moving to the brain stem, right, over here, and we are in midbrain. And in the midbrain, you will have what it's called red nucleus, and this area over here and here, substantia nigra. So they also associated with the basal ganglia, right? Hope makes sense. So why it's important? Though somewhat occlusive, the following area of basal nuclei are thought to be function. So this is thought to be function of basal nuclei. Influence muscular control, help regulate attention and cognition, regulate intensity or slow of stereotype movements, and inhibit antagonistic and unnecessary movements. That's why in the Parkinson's disease, what is the problem of people with Parkinson's disease? They cannot control the muscular activity, and they cannot inhibit tremors, antagonistic movements, right? So they have tremor when they don't, they don't want it. So when they don't voluntarily move their muscles, especially their arms and hands, right? So that's a basal nuclei. So very quickly, just review. So we just said that central nervous system includes brain and spinal cord, right? Now in the brain, we didn't look at different lobes because that's in a lab lecture, but we looked at cerebral cortex and we looked at 3 major area: motor area, sensory area, and association areas, right? And then, of course, where they're located and what they're responsible for. But that's a cortex. Now, when we look, okay, well, how about what is under that cortex, right? So we have cortex, what is under it? Well, under it, you will have white matter, and those are axons. They look white because they're myelinated. And this is where information moves back, front and back, up and down, right and left, and depends what fibers, are there, right? I mean, how these fibers move the information, they have different names, right? Commissure, right and left, projection fibers, up and down, association fibers, front and back, so within one hemisphere. That's a white fibers. But what, do we only have white stuff? Do we only have axons in this subcortical area? No, we also have gray matter. So shown here in actually like purple color here, a pink color here. Well, this, first of all, this is thalamus, the purple, right? But these 3 parts, this is called basal nuclei or basal ganglia, right? And they made of caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus. And we believe, right, that they're responsible for all this function, right? Muscular control, attention cognition, intensity of slow stereotype movement, and inhibit antagonistic and unnecessary movement, right? And basal ganglia also associated with substantia nigra in the midbrain and red nucleus. Okay, now let's look at cerebellar. So that was cerebrum. Now, what about cerebellum? I hope you guys know where cerebellum is located, right? So let's go ahead with my picture and yeah, so here, for example, right? So this is the cerebellum, or this one, this is the cerebellum. Now, very quickly, and of course, it just like very quick overview because first of all, there's so many different functions. Your brain is extremely complicated. Some of the function of the brain is still not fully understood, right? So that's just very quick introduction. But cerebellum receives impulses from the cerebral cortex of the intent to initiate voluntary muscle contraction. So when you decide to move any part of your body, right, this initial thought originates from your cerebral cortex, pre-central gyrus, right? Primary motor cortex. But then this information is sent to the cerebellum. Signals from proprioceptors and visual receptors in equilibrium continuously inform the cerebellum of the body position and movement. So your cerebellum constantly receives signals from your muscles, from your joints, from your eyes, visual information, and even whatever receives cerebellum, you do not understand, right? But you have an idea, kind of, right? What's going on around you, right? You know where your parts of your body are. That's what proprioception is. You know what's surrounding you, so you can make this informed decision about movement. So cerebellar cortex calculates the best way to smoothly coordinate a muscle contraction. Blueprint of coordinated movement is sent to cerebral motor cortex and to brain stem nuclei. So that's really complicated process. So kind of like, let me go back to the these homunculus, where you have them. So for example, if you guys decide to move your fingers, right, that's your primary premotor cortex. So this is where this thought originates. But before you even moving it, this information first moves to your cerebellum, right? Cerebellum gonna compare with, you know, kind of compare all the information that it received from your proprioceptors, from your visual information, and will coordinate the best movement. So from cerebellum, the information goes back here, right? And then to your spinal cord and to your muscles, right? So we're kind of moving from cortex to the cerebellum, from cerebellum back to the cortex, and then from cortex to the spinal cord, and from spinal cord to your muscles. Okay, so let me go back. And of course, this is all happen without your cognition, right? Because you cannot really spend like a couple minutes even thinking, okay, I need to move my fingers, so well, let me just decide how I do it, right? We would never be able to survive if this involved our consciousness. However, your cerebellum does have some cognitive function, and this include it's recognize and predict sequences of events during complex movement and play a role in non-motor functions such as association, word association, and puzzle solving. So when you solve a puzzle or you play these word games, that's also partially cerebellum is responsible for you be able to do it. Now we also have two more functional brain systems, right? We talk about cortex, right? We talk about cerebellum, But we have two more functional brain systems that discussed in this chapter, and it's limbic system and reticular formation. So let's see what limbic system. Limbic system is extremely complicated system, and it's not anatomical part, it's a physiological part. So it includes different anatomical structure. All right, so you can see that limbic system includes some part of the diencephalon, right? And diencephalon, it's your thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, right? So mammillary bodies, that's your diencephalon. So diencephalon parts that I include, it's actually some nuclei, anterior thalamic nuclei, right? So over here, hypothalamus, right, shown here, and mammillary body. So limbic system includes part of the diencephalon. It includes septum pellucidum. Well, septum pellucidum is a structure between two lateral ventricles. It includes olfactory bulb. It includes this structure that is called fornix. Well, cingulate gyrus over here, amygdala, hippocampus. I'm not asking you to memorize any, well, all of this structure. I want you to know that limbic system is physiological system, include part of the diencephalon and part of the, other part of the brain, including amygdala and hippocampus. I think here the two parts that you need to know. Amygdala recognizes angry or fearful facial expression, assesses danger, and elicits the fear response. So amygdala is responsible for your fear, and fear can save your life, right? So if you know there is a, I don't know, some dangerous situation, maybe a bridge across the canyon, and this bridge is, doesn't look very stable, amygdala will make you afraid and you will not use this bridge, and that might possibly save your life, right? Also, if you see a person with an angry face, your amygdala allow you to recognize this is fearful facial expression. And better don't mess with this person, right? So that's a very important part of amygdala. There are some studies done, and it's not confirmed yet, but they're looking at amygdala in a serial killers in the people who, commit some crime, and they would just wonder, like, if you killing or raping people, shouldn't you kind of be aware of a danger of it, that you can be caught and you can be put in maybe prison for your life, or even get a death penalty, right? So they were wondering why these people are not afraid of consequences. And because of what makes us afraid is amygdala, so they start thinking like, let's look, maybe amygdala look different. But again, it's just a interesting research that's going on, nothing being supported yet. But it's just interesting how some people ignore their this danger and fear, and don't realize consequences of their actions. So maybe amygdala is responsible, who knows, right now. Cingulate gyrus play a role in expressing emotion via gesture and resolving mental conflict. And plus your limbic system, so not only its emotional system, it's also, well, it's emotional, again, puts emotional response to orders. For example, skunks smell bad, right? So that's physiological systems that we cover here, limbic system. And another functional system of the brain, reticular formation. Here, let's read a little bit more. I forgot about this slide. So the limbic system interacts with the prefrontal lobe. Therefore, we can react emotionally to things we consciously understand to be happening, right? Not only, you see your child, start walking or something. You don't just see, okay, look, my baby just start walking, right? You have this emotion to this action, right? That's a job of your limbic system. And we consciously aware of emotional richness in our life. And another part of the limbic system, very briefly over here, is hippocampus. That plays role in memory. And they believe that we still have even neurons that are capable of mitosis, or neurons that can divide in hippocampus, because mature neurons don't divide. Right, so hippocampus is a part of limbic system. Okay, now reticular formation, it's another functional system, and it's actually located in a brain stem, along the brain stem, because limbic system is located where it's subcortical, right? It's under your cortex, deep to your cortex, and it does include part of the diencephalon, but reticular formation, that's the brain stem. Okay, so if you look over here, right, and what is here? We have, okay, so that's midbrain, right? So I think that's midbrain and upper pons, low pons and medulla, right? So that's a brain stem here. I'm reminding you that brain stem is made from midbrain, pons, and medulla. Midbrain superficial, then pons, and then medulla is the inferior. So superior, superficial, I'm sorry. Superior is midbrain and inferior is medulla. So, and those are gray matter, right? So we have group of nuclei. Remember, nuclei are gray matter. So we have this midline nucleus, we have medial nucleus and lateral nucleus. Right, so that's just, neurons that form, and dendrites that form this, this gray matter in your brainstem, called reticular formation. Now, in reticular formation, we have RAS center, reticular activating system. This system sends impulses to the cerebral cortex to keep it conscious and alert. It also filters out repetitive and weak stimuli. So your reticular formation filters out about 99% of all stimuli, right? Because without it, it would be just confusion of the brain. If every single stimuli reach your cerebral cortex, it's too much information. It would be very hard on your brain. So that's what reticular formation does. Now, it does communicate with your cerebral cortex. That's why you're conscious and alert. Now, when patients are in coma, it's like, I don't know exact number, but you would think a person is in coma, what part of the brain is most likely to be damaged, right? And usually students think, well, maybe my frontal lobe, right? Because that's where my consciousness is. But I would say about 80 or maybe even more patients that are in coma, they have injury in this RAS center, in the reticular formation. So this is the RAS, and another center of reticular formation is motor center. It has a motor function. So motor function of reticular formation. So first function is to keep you alert and conscious, right? Because when you're not alert and you're not conscious, then you're in coma. and it's also filter weak stimuli. But another function of reticular formation is motor function, and it helps control a coarse limb movement. And reticular autonomic center regulate visceral motor function, vasomotor, cardiac, respiratory center, right? So that's a lot of important centers located in reticular formation. So over here you can see, so that part shows us reticular formation, like a purple part, right? And how it's communicate with cerebral cortex. It's received some sensory information, and it's also has descending fibers to regulate your motor functions. Okay, so that's pretty much all about part of the brain briefly again. Next part of this chapter is blood-brain barrier that helps maintain stable environment of the brain, separates neuron from some blood-borne substances. So in this diagram, what you can see are capillaries. So reminding you that capillaries are very small, the smallest blood vessels. So in general, through your body, this is how your capillaries would look like, right? The cells that forming them, right? So this is our endothelial cells, right? So it kind of epithelial, but because they're not on the surface, we call them endothelial cells. And so that's the nucleus of the cell over here. That's the cell membrane. And they form those little tubes. And inside we have blood and we have pores, so allow substances to move in and out, right? Because that's the purpose of your capillaries, exchange, right? Nutrient exchange, gas exchange. However, in your brain, you have your endothelial cells, right? But you also have feet of astrocytes. And astrocytes are glial cells in your brain, right? So, so those are supporting cells that support your neurons. And astrocytes specifically, they form this kind of like barrier, right? Coverage that prevent substances from leaving your blood or entering your blood, because in your blood you can have some pathogens, right? You can have bacteria, you can have viruses. So your body want to make sure that your brain is really protected. So that's why the blood-brain barrier is formed around the brain capillaries. Of course, some of the part of the brain do not have this barrier. And another thing is, you still can have oxygen and nutrients move through this barrier, because you still need to bring oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. You need to bring glucose to your brain, all right? So it's not completely impermeable. But that might be a reason why some medication cannot reach your brain. So some infections of the brain and some diseases are hard to manage, because you can take medications, but those medications would never pass through this blood-brain barrier. Okay, so composition: endothelium of capillary walls, basal lamina, and feet of astrocytes. And those astrocytes not only form the barrier, they also signal this endothelium to form tight junction. So you see how here we have pore over here, and we have really tight junction between the endothelial cells. Here's another diagram. You can see astrocyte and feet, right? And how they cover capillaries of the brain, forming this blood-brain barrier. Its selective barrier allows nutrients to move by facilitated diffusion, allows any fat-soluble substances to pass, including alcohol, nicotine, anesthetics. Absent in some area, like vomiting center and the hypothalamus, where it is necessary to monitor the chemical composition of the blood. So if you need to monitor chemical composition of the blood, you cannot have this barrier, otherwise substances cannot penetrate. Okay, now quickly about some homeostatic imbalances of the brain. traumatic brain injuries, concussion and contusion. Concussion is temporary alternation in function, and contusion is permanent damage. And just remember that, definition. Subdural or subarachnoid hemorrhage, that when we have some breakage in a blood vessel and we have blood entering subdural space or subarachnoid space, over here, for example, and it may force brain stem through the foramen magnum that result in death. So very dangerous condition. Cerebral edema is swelling of the brain associated with traumatic head injury. Right, so next we have CVA. CVA is stroke. The name is cerebral vascular accident. When blood circulation is blocked and brain tissue dies, for example, blockage of cerebral artery by a blood clot, typically leads to hemiplegia. Hemiplegia means only one side of the body is affected. So if the patient has problem with left side or right side, sometimes it's a sensory and speech deficits, not speed. So CVA is death of the brain cells, right? And why would they die? Oh, they start dying mostly because they don't get oxygen. So if they don't get oxygen, then they cannot produce ATP, they cannot make ATP, they cannot function, so they start dying. And unfortunately, neurons, they don't reproduce, they don't divide, right? So this damage is, permanent damage. But the good thing is, because your brain is pretty flexible, the other part of the brain can kind of take the function of damaged part. So, but this is severe, severe stuff. But TIA is a transient ischemic attack. It's a temporary episode of the strokes. Or cerebral ischemia. Ischemia means low oxygen supply. So TIA, we call it mini strokes, right? So so that's kind of like smaller accident, and here we just we can have either just depletion of oxygen, this is what ischemia is, or even if some part of the brain dies, it's usually a very small area. So we might have the same symptoms, but they usually goes away. But TIA, why TIA is dangerous? Because usually this is a sign that a bigger stroke is coming, right? So a patient might have several TIA accidents and they might get back completely to normal. Again, we call it mini strokes, but that indicates there is some problems. So there is some problem with arteries of the brain. So they clot somewhere. So, or there is maybe a moving embolism or something, but something that restricts blood flow to the brain, right? And TIA will show us that it might be a bigger stroke in the future. And we have TPA. This is the only approved treatment for the stroke, tissue plasmagen activator. And I think you guys cover in 50A when we talk about hemostasis, or we're gonna cover it here later, part of it, when we talk about cardiovascular system. But TPA is approved treatment. Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington disease, right? Those are degenerative brain disorders. AD, progressive degenerative disorders of the brain that result in dementia. Parkinson's disease, degeneration of dopamine releasing neurons is a substantial nigra. Huntington disease is a hereditary disorder that causes accumulation of protein huntingtin that leads to degeneration of the basal nuclei and cerebral cortex. Now, so that was a homeostatic imbalances of brain. Now a little bit about spinal cord trauma, because spinal cord is a part of the central nervous system. So you can either lose sensation, paresthesia, or you can lose motion, that will be paralysis. So when we're talking about paralysis, there is two major types of paralysis. There is a flaccid paralysis and spastic paralysis. So flaccid paralysis, when there is no any nerve impulses reaching your muscles, right? So muscles cannot be stimulated. You cannot stimulate them, and even involuntary, they cannot be stimulated, even through the reflexes. So the person with flaccid paralysis would not have any reflexes. Muscles are completely cut off the neural supply. And this causes muscle atrophy, right? So muscles are soft, they're not stimulated. And this is the damage of the ventral root of ventral horn cells. I don't know if you guys remember it or not, let me very quickly. So if you're looking at the spinal cord, right? So here, so here, if this is the spinal cord, you know, in the spinal cord, you have kind of like structure like this, right? So this is anterior and this is posterior, right? So this gray matter, right, inside, this part is called ventral, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, right here and here. This is called ventral horn, and then, you know, we have like ventral, this ventral root and this dorsal root, and then they kind of come together to make the, why, something wrong over here. So kind of these roots come together, making spinal nerve, right? So that would be, I would say it like this, yeah. So that's a spinal nerve, right? So, when we have a flaccid paralysis, the damage is here, ventral root, right? Or ventral horn, or right here. That means even reflexes, right? Even because reflexes go through this arch, right? From sensory over here, so making this loop, right? Reflexes cannot stimulate your muscles either, right? Now, when we have spastic paralysis, then the damage to upper motor neurons or the primary motor cortex. So here the damage would be, so here's the brain, right? So here's the brain, brain stem, and then spinal cord, right? So damage is gonna be in the motor cortex, primary motor cortex, that we just discussed what the primary motor cortex is, or these neurons that move down through the spinal cord, right? So over here. And then the muscles can be activated by reflex activity, but no voluntary control of the muscle, right? So that's a different type of paralysis, either flaccid paralysis or spastic paralysis. Now, what is transection? Transection is cross-section of the spinal cord at any level, and then you lose both sensory sensation and motor function, right? Right? No sensation, loss of sensation, and lot of motor, both. That's what transection is. Now, depends where you have this trauma, right? Where you have this cross section. It can be paraplegia or quadriplegia. So paraplegia is only when only your legs are affected. So you don't have sensation and movement in your lower extremities, in your legs, right? And this is when we have this transection between T1 and L1. But when you have transection in the cervical region, it will be quadriplegia. Quadriplegia, loss of sensation and movement in both limbs. upper and low, so arms and legs, no sensation, no movement. Quadra means 4 and para means 2. So paraplegia, only legs are affected. Quadriplegia, arms and legs are affected, and it's again depends where this cross section is present. If it's in cervical region, it will be quadriplegia. So let's see. Next is polymyelitis. So polymyelitis is destruction of the ventral horn motor neurons by a virus, poliovirus, and cause muscle atrophy. This may occur due to the paralysis of respiratory muscle and cardiac arrest. So here you can see these kids that had this polymyelitis, so they stay disabled the rest of their life, unfortunately. ALS, so this guy, what his name is. So that's why he died from it. And Lou Gehrig disease is another name, and it involves progressive destruction of ventral horn motor neurons and fibers of the pyramidal tract. Pyramidal tract, it's the one that inside your spinal cord. And again, ventral horn for motor neurons. Symptoms: loss of ability to speak, swallow and breathe. This typically occurs within 5 years. So that's really kind of like immune system attacks your neurons. That's it. So, well, thank you for watching. I hope it was helpful. Let me stop recording so I can take your questions if you have any.